My name is Corinne Baptiste, and I was 31 years old the morning after my wedding when I opened my laptop, still half asleep in a hotel robe with rice confetti in my hair, and found a termination letter sitting in my inbox with a timestamp of 6 a.m. I want you to sit with that timestamp for a second, because I have. 6 in the morning. My boss, a woman named Diane Wexford, had been awake and composing that email before the hotel's continental breakfast had even opened downstairs, before my new husband had stirred beside me, before the flowers from the reception had finished wilting in their vases in the ballroom 2 floors below us. I read it twice, standing in the bathroom doorway, the phone shaking slightly in my hand, my husband's voice calling out from the bed, asking what was wrong. Effective immediately, the letter said, "Your position as Senior Account Director has been eliminated as part of a restructuring of the Client Services Division. We wish you the best in your future endeavors." There was no severance mentioned in that first email, though one would eventually arrive, small and grudging, 3 weeks later, after my own attorney got involved. I sat down on the edge of the hotel bathtub, still wearing the robe with the little embroidered bee on the pocket that the hotel had left as a wedding gift, and I read that email a third time, and somewhere underneath the shock, a colder, clearer thought started to surface. The kind of thought that would end up taking me 4 years to fully act on. I had built the single largest account at that firm with my own 2 hands over 6 years, and the woman who fired me the morning after my wedding was about to hand that account and my job to my husband's ex-girlfriend. Before I tell you what happened next, tell me where you're watching this from and what time it is where you are. I always like knowing that. Now let me take you back to the beginning, because you need to understand 6 years of quiet, careful work before you can understand exactly what Diane Wexford didn't know she'd just given away. I started at Ashford Meridian Consulting when I was 25, a junior account associate hired straight out of a graduate program in organizational strategy, one of 6 new analysts brought on that year, most of whom didn't last past their second year. Ashford Meridian was a mid-sized management consulting firm specializing in operational strategy for regional healthcare networks, the kind of unglamorous, essential work that never makes headlines but keeps hospital systems from collapsing under their own administrative weight. I loved it from almost the first week. The particular satisfaction of walking into a chaotic client organization and slowly, methodically, finding the places where a small structural change could save real money and, more importantly, actually improve patient care. I remember my first assignment vividly, a modest engagement helping a small community hospital redesign its discharge planning process. Tedious work that involved sitting through dozens of hours of case reviews, tracking exactly where patients experienced delays between medical clearance and actual discharge. Most of the other new analysts in my cohort found that kind of granular, repetitive work draining, and 2 of them left the firm within 18 months for roles that promised more visible, client-facing responsibility. I found something different in it entirely, a kind of quiet absorption in the puzzle of it, the satisfaction of finally identifying the exact bottleneck in a process everyone else had simply accepted as unfixable. I didn't know, at the time, that this particular temperament, patient rather than flashy, would eventually become both the foundation of my entire career and, indirectly, the reason Diane Wexford would come to see me as useful in a way that never quite translated into genuine respect. Diane Wexford ran the Client Services Division, and from the beginning, my relationship with her was complicated in a way I didn't fully understand until much later. She was sharp, undeniably talented at business development, the kind of person who could walk into a room full of skeptical hospital administrators and leave 45 minutes later with a signed engagement letter. But she had almost no patience for the actual operational work that made those engagements successful once they were signed. And somewhere in my second year at the firm, she began quietly steering the difficult, detail-heavy accounts toward me while keeping the flashier, relationship-driven work for herself. I remember a specific conversation from my second year, sitting in Diane's office while she reviewed my quarterly performance. The 2 of us surrounded by the framed magazine clippings she kept on her walls, features on regional business leaders, awards from the local Chamber of Commerce, the particular curated confidence of someone who had built her entire professional identity around being seen as a winner. She told me, that afternoon, that I had a gift for the parts of the work most consultants found tedious, and I remember not being entirely sure, even then, whether she meant it as a compliment or as a way of explaining why she intended to keep the more visible, more prestigious accounts for herself. "Some people close deals," she said, and some people keep them closed. We need both, Corrine. Don't ever think the second thing is less important just because it gets less attention. I believed her, mostly, for a long time. It would take me years to understand that believing something doesn't always protect you from the person who told it to you. I didn't mind, at first. I was good at the detail work, genuinely good at it. The kind of careful, patient analysis that most people in consulting find tedious, but that I found almost meditative, untangling a hospital system's supply chain inefficiencies or restructuring a network scheduling software until the numbers finally made sense. I built a reputation within the firm over those early years as the person you brought in when an account was in genuine trouble, when a client relationship had soured over missed deadlines or unmet promises, and I developed, without ever quite planning to, a particular expertise in exactly the kind of turnaround work that Diane herself was never especially good at. The account that would eventually define my entire career at Ashford Meridian came to me in my third year, almost by accident. Cresthaven Regional Health Network, a mid-sized hospital system spanning 4 counties, had been an Ashford Meridian client for 2 years under a different account director who left the firm abruptly, and the account, in the chaotic weeks after his departure, was quietly reassigned to me, largely because nobody more senior wanted to inherit what was, at the time, a genuinely troubled relationship. Cresthaven's leadership was frustrated. The previous director had overpromised and underdelivered on a major scheduling system overhaul, and the firm's partners had privately begun discussing whether the account was worth keeping at all. I want to tell you about the 18 months that followed, because they are the 18 months that built everything that came after, and because I think the specific, unglamorous work of rebuilding something matters more to this story than any single confrontation ever could. I spent my first month on the Cresthaven account simply listening, sitting in on meetings I hadn't been invited to lead, asking the hospital system's chief operating officer, a careful, skeptical woman named Renata Okonkwo, what had actually gone wrong rather than assuming I already knew. Renata told me, bluntly, in our second meeting, that she had already begun drafting a termination letter for the engagement and had only held off because the contract's exit clause was expensive enough to make her want to be certain before pulling the trigger. I remember that meeting vividly, sitting across from her in a windowless conference room at Cresthaven's administrative building, understanding that I had perhaps one real chance to prove the relationship was worth saving. I proposed something unusual for the firm at the time, a complete reset of the scheduling system project, starting over from the actual clinical staff's workflow needs rather than the software vendor's default assumptions, which is where the previous director's project had gone wrong from the very beginning. It meant admitting, formally, in writing, that 18 months of prior work needed to be substantially redone, an admission that made several partners at Ashford Meridian deeply uncomfortable, since it implicitly criticized work the firm had already billed for. Diane, I remember, was furious when she found out I'd made that admission to the client directly rather than routing it through her first. "You don't apologize to clients, Corrine," she told me, standing in my office doorway with her arms crossed. "You reframe. There's a difference." I didn't reframe. I told Renata Okonkwo the truth, and something in that honesty, I think, was exactly what that relationship had been missing. Over the following 14 months, I rebuilt the scheduling project from the ground up, spending weeks embedded directly in Cresthaven's hospitals, shadowing nurses and shift supervisors, building a system that actually reflected how people worked rather than how a vendor's sales deck assumed they should. By the time the project launched, 18 months later than originally promised, but finally, genuinely functional, Cresthaven's clinical staff turnover had dropped by nearly a fifth. A number hospital administrators pay very close attention to, because turnover in nursing staff is one of the most expensive problems a hospital system faces. Renata Okonkwo became, over those months, one of the most important professional relationships of my career, not because she was warm or effusive. She wasn't particularly either, but because she was honest. And she came to trust me specifically because I had been honest with her first. When Cresthaven's board discussed expanding their relationship with Ashford Meridian the following year, adding a second major engagement around supply chain restructuring across all 4 counties, Renata insisted, explicitly, in a phone call I later learned about secondhand, that the expanded contract be routed through me specifically, not through Diane, not through anyone else at the firm. That expanded contract, over the following 4 years, grew into the single largest account at Ashford Meridian Consulting, worth, by the time of my wedding, just over $11 million annually in billings, nearly a third of the entire firm's revenue. I want to be careful here not to overstate my role, because plenty of people at the firm contributed meaningfully to that account over the years: junior analysts, technical specialists, project managers who executed the work I designed. But the relationship itself, the trust that made Cresthaven willing to keep expanding its engagement year after year, existed because of a specific, deliberate choice I had made in my third year at the firm to tell a skeptical hospital executive the truth when it would have been easier to reframe. I met my husband, Julian, during my 5th year at Ashford Meridian, at a mutual friend's dinner party. The same ordinary, unremarkable way most important things in my life seemed to begin. Julian worked as an architect, careful and thoughtful, in a way that matched something in me I hadn't realized I was looking for until I found it, and we dated for just over a year before he proposed, and another year after that before the wedding itself, a small ceremony at a converted barn venue 2 hours outside the city, exactly the kind of understated, personal celebration both of us had wanted. I didn't know, when Julian and I first started dating, that he had an ex-girlfriend named Priya Malhotra who worked in consulting. And I certainly didn't know, for the first several months of our relationship, that Priya Malhotra worked at Ashford Meridian Consulting too, in a different division, business development rather than client services, a division that reported, as it happened, directly to Diane Wexford. I want to tell you how I found out, because the way I found out matters. I learned about Priya roughly 8 months into dating Julian, at a work function. Actually, an Ashford Meridian holiday party I'd invited him to attend as my guest. We were standing near the bar when a woman approached us with the particular brightness of someone who has rehearsed exactly how casual she wants to appear, introduced herself to Julian as though they'd never met, and then, watching his face carefully, said, "It's been a while, Julian. You look well." I remember the specific stillness that came over Julian in that moment. The careful, controlled way he introduced her to me as someone he used to date, and the way Priya's eyes moved over me with an assessment I recognized immediately, because I had done the same thing myself, once or twice, sizing up a predecessor. Julian told me the full story that night, honestly and without much prompting, the way he told me most things. He and Priya had dated for nearly 3 years, on and off, through most of their mid-20s, a relationship that had ended, according to Julian, largely because Priya's ambition and his own need for a quieter, steadier life had simply never fully aligned, though the ending itself had apparently been messier than that clean summary suggested, with at least one serious reconciliation attempt in the middle of it that hadn't worked out either. I want to be fair to Julian here, because I don't think he handled any of it maliciously or even particularly carelessly. He simply hadn't thought to mention, early in our relationship, that his ex-girlfriend worked at the same firm I did, largely, I think, because their paths inside that firm had never once crossed, given how different our divisions were. I didn't think much more about Priya Malhotra for the next several years, beyond the occasional awkward encounter at a company-wide event, a strained but polite nod in a hallway, the kind of careful distance 2 women maintain when they share a connection neither particularly wants to examine closely. I focused on the Cresthaven account, on the wedding planning that eventually consumed most of my evenings during my final year at the firm, on building the life Julian and I were slowly constructing together outside of work entirely. I want to tell you about the 6 months leading up to my wedding, because the pattern that would eventually explain everything was already quietly forming during that stretch, though I didn't recognize it clearly until much later. Diane Wexford's relationship with me had grown noticeably colder over my final 2 years at the firm. A shift I attributed, at the time, to the ordinary friction of managing an increasingly senior, increasingly independent account director who no longer needed her oversight the way I once had. Diane had built her entire career on relationship-driven business development, and I think, in retrospect, she had never quite made peace with the fact that the firm's single largest account had grown to its current size, specifically because I had ignored her advice about reframing rather than being honest, back in my 3rd year, and had been right to ignore it. What I didn't know, during those final months, was that Priya Malhotra had been promoted, roughly a year before my wedding, into a newly created role within Diane's division, a role focused specifically on what the firm called strategic account development, a role that gave her increasing visibility into the firm's largest and most valuable client relationships, including Cresthaven, even though she had no formal connection to that account herself. I learned, much later, through a former colleague who reached out to me after everything had already happened, that Priya had spent much of that year quietly cultivating a closer relationship with Diane, specifically positioning herself in a way that colleague described as remarkably deliberate, as someone Diane could trust to eventually take over the firm's most important accounts. I got married on a Saturday in early October, a small, warm ceremony surrounded by people I loved. And I want to tell you honestly that the day itself was everything I'd hoped it would be, entirely separate from anything happening at Ashford Meridian, entirely mine and Julian's. I didn't think about work at all that day, didn't check my phone once during the ceremony or the reception, allowed myself, for one full day, to simply be a woman marrying the person she loved. The termination email arrived at 6 the following morning. I want to walk you through what happened over the following weeks, because the specific mechanics of how I was pushed out matter for understanding what came later. I called Julian first, before I called anyone at the firm, sitting on the edge of that hotel bathtub while he read the email over my shoulder, his jaw tightening in a way I rarely saw. "The day after our wedding," he said quietly, more than once, as though repeating it might help him fully absorb it. He wanted to call Diane immediately, and I remember talking him out of it, telling him I needed to be the one to make that call myself whenever I was actually ready, and not a single moment before. We spent that first day of what was supposed to be the beginning of our honeymoon largely in silence, sitting on the hotel balcony overlooking the water, Julian's hand resting on my back while I stared out at a view I couldn't have described to you afterward if my life depended on it. The formal explanation, when I finally got Diane on the phone 3 days after the wedding, from the resort where Julian and I had planned to spend our honeymoon, was a restructuring of the client services division, a consolidation of senior roles that the firm's managing partner, a distant, rarely seen figure named Harold Ashford, had apparently approved the previous month. Diane delivered this explanation with the same practiced, professional coolness she'd delivered client updates with for years, and when I asked, directly, who would be taking over the Cresthaven account, there was a pause on the line long enough that I understood the answer before she said it out loud. "Priya Malhotra will be assuming account leadership," Diane said. "She's been developing strong relationships within our strategic accounts practice, and I believe she's well positioned to continue the excellent work you've done there." I sat on the edge of the hotel bed in my honeymoon suite, Julian's hand on my back, and I asked Diane the question I already suspected, I knew the answer to, though I wanted to hear her actually say it. "Diane, does Priya have any prior experience with Cresthaven? Any direct relationship with Renata Okonkwo or the rest of their leadership team?" "She'll be building that relationship," Diane said, a phrase so carefully evasive that it told me everything I needed to know. I want to be honest about what happened over the following months, because I think the emotional reality of being pushed out matters just as much as the strategic reality that eventually emerged from it. I was devastated in a way that took me genuinely by surprise. Not just professionally, but personally. The particular grief of having 6 years of careful, patient work handed to someone else the morning after the happiest day of my life. Someone who, I understood with growing clarity, had likely spent the better part of a year quietly positioning herself to inherit exactly what I'd built. I cried more in the first 2 weeks after that termination email than I had at any point during the actual wedding planning, and Julian, to his enormous credit, absorbed all of it without once trying to minimize what had happened or rush me toward feeling better before I was ready to. My closest friend from graduate school, a woman named Odette who had gone on to work in hospital administration herself, flew in for a weekend about a month after the termination, ostensibly to see how the newlyweds were settling in, though I understood and appreciated that the real purpose of the visit was to make sure I wasn't drowning quietly on my own. We sat on my living room floor one night, a bottle of wine between us, and she asked me the question nobody else had quite managed to ask directly. "Do you think it was about the job? Or do you think it was about you specifically? Diane could have restructured without firing you the day after your wedding. That timing wasn't an accident, Karine." I didn't have a full answer for her that night, though the question stayed with me, quietly, for a long time afterward, long before I had any real evidence connecting Priya's promotion to my termination at all. I did eventually consult an employment attorney, a careful, thorough woman named Bettina Cross, who reviewed my termination and confirmed what I already suspected, that the firm's stated restructuring rationale was almost certainly a pretext, though proving that formally, in a way that would hold up in any legal proceeding, would be difficult and expensive and, ultimately, according to Bettina's own honest assessment, unlikely to change the underlying outcome even if I won. I negotiated a slightly improved severance package with Bettina's help, 3 months' salary rather than the initial insulting offer, along with a formal non-disparagement clause that, I would come to understand years later, cut both directions in ways Diane Wexford clearly hadn't thought through carefully enough at the time. I want to tell you about the 4 years that followed, because they are the years that built everything that came after. The same slow, unglamorous, deliberate kind of building that had once turned a troubled hospital relationship into the largest account at an entire consulting firm. I started my own independent consulting practice 6 months after leaving Ashford Meridian, initially working out of a small home office, taking on individual project work for healthcare organizations too small to justify a large firm engagement, but large enough to need genuine operational expertise. Julian was steady and encouraging through all of it, the way he had been from the very first week after my termination, never once suggesting I should simply find another corporate role rather than building something of my own. Understanding, I think, better than I did myself at the time, that I needed to prove something to myself that had nothing to do with anyone else's validation. I remember the first project I landed on my own, a small rural hospital system, 2 counties over struggling with a billing reconciliation problem so tangled that 3 previous consultants had apparently given up on it entirely. I spent 6 weeks embedded in their finance department, the same patient, methodical approach I'd once brought to Cresthaven. And when I finally untangled the root cause, a years-old software migration error nobody had ever fully traced, the hospital's chief financial officer nearly cried with relief in a conference room that smelled like old coffee and printer toner. That project paid a fraction of what a single week at Ashford Meridian once billed for my time, and it remains, even now, one of the proudest pieces of work I've ever done, because nobody handed it to me and nobody was watching to make sure I got credit for it. I did it because it needed doing, and I did it well. I built my practice slowly, the way I'd built the Cresthaven relationship years earlier, through careful, patient work and honest relationships rather than flashy business development. I named the firm Baptiste Health Strategy, my own name, a deliberate choice I made for the same reasons I imagine other people in similar situations have made similar choices, wanting something built entirely on my own terms to carry my own name rather than borrowing credibility from an institution that had discarded me the morning after my wedding. I didn't reach out to Cresthaven directly during those early years, out of professional courtesy as much as the non-disparagement clause Bettina had negotiated, though I heard through the small, interconnected world of regional healthcare consulting that the relationship had grown increasingly strained under Priya's leadership. Healthcare consulting is a smaller world than people outside it realize, and word travels, carefully and quietly, through conference circuits and shared vendor relationships and the particular gossip that flows between hospital administrators who all know each other from state association meetings. I heard, secondhand, that Priya had struggled with exactly the kind of detail-heavy, patient operational work that Cresthaven's ongoing engagement actually required, that she was talented at the relationship-building Diane had valued, but genuinely uncomfortable with the unglamorous, methodical work of keeping a complex, multi-year engagement actually functioning well. My own practice, meanwhile, grew steadily, the way these things sometimes do when you focus entirely on doing careful, honest work rather than chasing growth for its own sake. By my 3rd year independent, I had 5 employees, a small but genuinely excellent team I'd built deliberately, hiring people who shared my particular obsession with the unglamorous details that actually make healthcare operations function. We specialized, by then, almost entirely in exactly the kind of complex, multi-year hospital network engagements that had once defined my career at Ashford Meridian and our reputation, though modest in scale compared to a firm like Ashford Meridian, had become genuinely excellent within the specific niche of regional healthcare operational strategy. I want to tell you about the specific structure of the Cresthaven contract, because it matters enormously to everything that happened next, and because it is, in its own quiet way, the entire reason this story has an ending worth telling. When I originally rebuilt the Cresthaven scheduling project in my 3rd year at Ashford Meridian, and later when the relationship expanded into the larger supply chain engagement, I had insisted, over some internal resistance from the firm's contracts department, on a particular clause in the master service agreement, a clause that named the account's original architect of record as a required approver. For any material contract renewal, amendment, or change in scope exceeding a certain financial threshold. I had insisted on this clause not out of any strategic foresight about my own future, but out of a genuine, practical concern at the time, having watched what happened to the previous account director's work when a poorly designed handoff nearly cost the firm the entire relationship. I wanted, simply, to protect the client from exactly the kind of instability I'd watched nearly destroy the relationship in its early years. A safeguard requiring that any major future changes to the engagement be reviewed and formally approved by whoever the contract identified as the account's original strategic architect, a role that, once assigned, could only be formally transferred through a written amendment I would personally need to sign. Nobody at Ashford Meridian, including Diane, had thought carefully about that clause when they terminated me the morning after my wedding. Contract renewals, in the ordinary rhythm of a consulting firm's business, happen quietly, routinely, handled by whoever currently manages the account, and I don't believe anyone involved in my termination gave any real thought to the specific language buried in a contract I had negotiated 4 years earlier, language that had simply never mattered, procedurally, until the exact moment it suddenly did. That moment arrived roughly 4 years after my termination, in the spring, when Cresthaven's engagement with Ashford Meridian came up for its scheduled major renewal, a 5-year renewal representing, by that point, nearly $14 million in annual billings, an amount that had grown even larger under Priya's leadership, despite, or perhaps because of, the operational struggles I'd heard about secondhand over the preceding years. I found out about the renewal, and about the clause suddenly becoming relevant, through a phone call I genuinely didn't expect, from Renata Okonkwo herself, whom I hadn't spoken to directly in nearly 4 years. "Corinne," she said, when I picked up, her voice exactly as direct and unhurried as I remembered it. "I understand our contract with Ashford Meridian requires your approval for this renewal. I wanted to call you myself before anyone else did, partly out of courtesy, and partly because I want your honest opinion about whether we should be renewing this relationship at all." I sat very still at my desk, absorbing what she was telling me, understanding, for the first time, the specific mechanism by which a clause I'd negotiated years earlier out of simple professional caution had quietly become the single most important piece of leverage in a much larger story I hadn't even realized was still unfolding. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because I think it matters more than any dramatic reaction I could describe. I didn't feel triumphant, not immediately. I felt, mostly, a kind of careful, deliberate curiosity, the same instinct that had once led me to spend a month simply listening before proposing any changes to Cresthaven's troubled relationship years earlier. I asked Renata to tell me, honestly, how the relationship had actually gone under Priya's leadership, and I want to walk you through what she told me, because it explained, in exhaustive detail, exactly what had happened in the 4 years since my termination. Renata told me that Priya had struggled almost from the beginning to maintain the kind of detailed, hands-on operational engagement the Cresthaven relationship genuinely required. 2 major project milestones had slipped significantly behind schedule over the preceding 3 years, each time explained away with the kind of confident, relationship-focused language that Renata had grown increasingly skeptical of over time. A key supply chain integration, meant to launch across all 4 counties within 18 months of the original expanded contract, had instead taken nearly 3 years, and even now, according to Renata, functioned inconsistently across 2 of the 4 county systems. Cresthaven's own internal satisfaction surveys, conducted annually as part of their vendor management process, had shown a steady decline in confidence in the Ashford Meridian relationship over each of the preceding 3 years, a decline that had accelerated sharply in the most recent survey cycle. "We've been debating internally for the better part of a year whether to renew at all," Renata told me. "Several members of our leadership team have advocated for putting the entire engagement out to a competitive bid process instead. I've held off, largely because I remember what this relationship looked like before you rebuilt it, and I didn't want to make a decision this significant without understanding your honest perspective first." I asked her, carefully, why the contract required my specific approval for the renewal rather than simply Ashford Meridian's current account leadership. She laughed, a short, genuinely surprised sound. "You don't know?" she asked. "Corinne, your firm's own contracts department flagged this to us weeks ago. apparently in some confusion, because the master service agreement you negotiated years ago names you specifically as the account's architect of record, with formal approval rights over any material renewal. I assumed you already knew that. I told her, honestly, that I had negotiated that clause years earlier as a simple protective measure, never imagining it would still be relevant after everything that had happened since, and I could hear, in the pause that followed, Renata absorbing the full implication of what I'd just told her. "So Ashford Meridian terminated you," she said slowly, "and then, apparently, never bothered to formally amend a contract that requires your sign-off on their largest account's renewal." "It appears that way," I said. "I want to tell you what happened over the following weeks, because the aftermath, once again, mattered just as much as the discovery itself. I met with Bettina Cross, my former employment attorney, to review the exact language of the clause, confirming what Renata had already told me. The master service agreement, still governing the Cresthaven relationship 4 years after my termination, formally required the approval of the account's named architect of record, meaning me, before any renewal exceeding the contract's specified financial threshold could be executed. Ashford Meridian could, in theory, have formally amended that language at any point over the preceding 4 years, removing my name and substituting Priya's or anyone else's, but doing so would have required my written consent to the amendment itself, consent nobody had ever actually sought, either because nobody had noticed the clause mattered until the renewal deadline arrived, or because, I suspected, somebody had noticed and simply hoped the issue would never actually surface. Bettina confirmed that the clause was fully enforceable, drafted carefully enough, years earlier, to withstand exactly the kind of scrutiny it was now receiving. "You built yourself a very effective piece of leverage, Corinne," she told me, "even if you didn't fully realize you were doing it at the time." I want to walk you through what I decided to do with that leverage, because I think the decision matters more than the leverage itself. I did not use the clause simply to block the renewal out of spite, the way I imagine some people, in my position, might have been tempted to. I asked Renata for time to review the full engagement history myself, the same careful, methodical review I would have conducted for any client considering whether to continue a struggling relationship, and I spent nearly 3 weeks going through everything Renata's team could share with me, the missed milestones, the declining satisfaction surveys, the specific operational failures behind each one. I remember sitting at my kitchen table late one night during that review, surrounded by printed status reports and satisfaction survey data spanning 4 years, and feeling a strange, unexpected wave of something closer to sadness than anger. Buried in the data was a hospital system genuinely trying, year after year, to make a difficult relationship work, sending increasingly detailed feedback that seemed to go largely unaddressed, requesting, more than once, according to internal meeting notes Renata's team shared with me, a return to the kind of embedded, hands-on operational approach that had once defined the relationship's early success. Nobody at Ashford Meridian, it seemed, had ever seriously considered that the client was quite literally asking for the exact model I had originally built, simply because nobody currently managing the account had the operational background to recognize what that request actually meant. What I found, reviewing that history in detail, was not simply that Priya had underperformed, though she genuinely had, but that the underlying structure of the relationship itself had drifted, over 4 years, away from the specific model that had made it successful in the first place, the deep, hands-on operational engagement embedded directly within Cresthaven's own clinical workflows, replaced, instead, with a more distant, relationship-focused management style that worked well for signing new business but poorly for sustaining the kind of complex, multi-year operational work Cresthaven actually needed. I called Renata after completing that review and told her, honestly, that I believed the relationship, as currently structured under Ashford Meridian's leadership, was not worth renewing, that 4 years of evidence suggested the firm's current approach fundamentally misunderstood what Cresthaven needed, regardless of any individual person's talent or effort. I also told her something else, something I had been considering carefully over those same 3 weeks. My own firm, Baptiste Health Strategy, now had the team, the expertise, and the operational track record to potentially take over the Cresthaven relationship directly if Cresthaven's leadership wanted to consider that option. I want to be careful here, because I think this is the part of the story where it would be easy to make myself sound more calculating than I actually felt at the time. I didn't propose this because I wanted revenge against Diane Wexford or Priya Malhotra. though I won't pretend some part of me didn't feel a certain grim satisfaction at the shape the situation had taken. I proposed it because it was genuinely the most honest professional recommendation I could offer a client I had spent years building trust with, and because I believed, with real confidence, that my own firm could serve Cresthaven's actual needs better than the organization currently managing the relationship. Renata's board reviewed the proposal over the following month, alongside 2 other competing bids from larger regional consulting firms, and ultimately selected Baptiste Health Strategy for a 5-year engagement beginning that fall, a contract worth, in its first year alone, just under $6 million, smaller than the $14 million Ashford Meridian had been billing, reflecting a leaner, more operationally focused engagement model I had designed specifically around what Cresthaven actually needed rather than what maximized billable hours. I remember the afternoon Renata called to tell me the board's decision, sitting at my own desk in the modest downtown office space my firm had moved into just 18 months earlier, small compared to Ashford Meridian's glass-walled suite, but entirely, unmistakably mine. The board wasn't just impressed by your proposal, Renata told me. Several of them remembered you personally, from years ago, from the scheduling project. One of our longest-serving nurse administrators specifically asked whether you were the same Corrine who used to shadow overnight shifts, just to understand how the staff actually worked. I told her yes, and I watched her face change completely. I sat with that for a long moment after we hung up, thinking about all those early mornings years earlier, embedded in hospital corridors long before anyone at Ashford Meridian had thought to notice or reward that kind of work. Understanding, finally, that none of it had actually been wasted, even during the years when it seemed like it had been handed to someone else entirely. I want to tell you about the phone call I received from Diane Wexford once Ashford Meridian formally learned they had lost the Cresthaven account, because it is, in its own way, the true climax of this entire story. Diane called me directly, something she hadn't done once in the 4 years since my termination, her voice carrying a controlled, careful anger that reminded me, oddly, of the same practiced coolness she'd used to deliver my termination explanation years earlier. "I understand you personally blocked our renewal," she said, without any preamble at all, and then swooped in to take the account for yourself. "I have to say, Corrine, I expected more professionalism from you than this." I let a moment of silence sit on the line before responding, the same deliberate pause I'd learned, years earlier, watching Renata Okonkwo handle difficult conversations with her own staff. "Diane," I said, "I didn't block anything." I reviewed 4 years of documented performance history, at the client's request, using approval authority that was written into a contract I negotiated specifically to protect Cresthaven from exactly the kind of unstable transition your firm put them through the morning after my wedding. If you want to discuss professionalism, I'm happy to have that conversation, but I don't think it will go the direction you're expecting. "You've been planning this," she said, her voice sharpening, "waiting for the moment you could take it back." "I wasn't waiting for anything, Diane," I said. "I built a firm. I hired good people. I did honest work for 4 years without ever once thinking about Cresthaven, because I genuinely believed I'd never have anything to do with that account again." Renata called me, not the other way around. And when she asked my professional opinion about whether her organization should keep renewing a relationship that had missed 2 major milestones and shown 3 straight years of declining satisfaction scores, I gave her an honest answer. The same kind of honest answer I gave her the first week I ever worked with her, back when you told me I should have reframed instead. There was a long pause on the line. "You could have simply approved the renewal," she said, her voice quieter now. "None of this had to happen this way." "I could have," I agreed. "But you fired me without cause the day after my wedding to hand my life's work to your business development director's protégé, and neither of you thought carefully enough about the contract to realize that decision would eventually cost you the account entirely. I'm not the one who created this outcome, Diane. I just happened to be the only person who actually understood the paperwork." She didn't have a response to that. The call ended shortly afterward, without either of us raising our voices further, and I sat at my desk for a long time afterward, feeling, mostly, a kind of quiet, settled clarity rather than any dramatic sense of vindication. I want to tell you what happened in the months that followed, because the aftermath mattered just as much as the confrontation itself. Ashford Meridian's loss of the Cresthaven account, representing nearly 1/3 of the firm's total revenue, triggered a broader crisis within the firm that played out, over the following year, largely outside my direct involvement, though I heard about pieces of it through the same small, interconnected professional world that had once carried news of Priya's struggles to me secondhand. Harold Ashford, the firm's managing partner, reportedly conducted a formal internal review of the account's loss, a review that, according to a former colleague who reached out to me quietly that winter, revealed the specific mechanics of my termination in far more detail than Diane had apparently ever expected to become visible to the firm's leadership. That former colleague, a project manager named Farah, who had worked under me during my last 2 years on the Cresthaven account and stayed on at the firm afterward, told me over coffee one afternoon that the internal review had uncovered emails, still sitting in the firm's archived servers, showing Diane and Priya discussing the account transition in explicit detail weeks before my termination was ever formally announced, language that made clear the restructuring narrative had been constructed after the fact rather than genuinely driving the decision. Harold was furious, Farah told me. Not because of what happened to you specifically, if I'm being honest, but because it cost the firm $14 million in annual billings and he'd had no idea any of it was happening until it was already too late to fix. I didn't feel especially satisfied hearing that, though I won't pretend it didn't matter to me at all. A small, quiet confirmation that I hadn't imagined the pattern I'd suspected for years. Diane Wexford left Ashford Meridian roughly 8 months after the Cresthaven loss, under circumstances my former colleague described only vaguely as a mutual parting of ways, though the timing suggested something considerably less mutual than that phrase implied. Priya Malhotra, I learned, had already left the firm several months earlier, taking a role at a smaller consulting practice in a different city entirely, a move that, whatever her private reasons, felt, to me, like its own quiet acknowledgement of how the Cresthaven relationship had actually gone under her leadership. I never spoke to Priya directly about any of it, then or since. Julian and I discussed, once, whether I should reach out, and we both agreed, fairly quickly, that there wasn't really anything productive left to say. Whatever had happened between the two of them years earlier, whatever role that history had played in her decision to position herself for my job, belonged to a chapter of both of our lives that felt, by that point, genuinely finished. Baptiste Health Strategy grew significantly in the 2 years following the Cresthaven engagement, not simply because of the account size, though that mattered, but because the story itself, quietly circulating through the same small professional world that had once carried news of my termination, established a kind of reputation I hadn't fully anticipated, a firm known specifically for the careful, patient, honest work that sustains complex client relationships rather than simply winning them. I hired 11 new employees over those 2 years, expanded into 2 additional states, and built, deliberately and slowly, the kind of firm I had always wanted to build, one where the unglamorous, detail-heavy work that actually makes organizations function was valued as much as the flashier business development that too often gets all the credit. I made a point, hiring for that growth, of looking specifically for the kind of people Diane's old firm had always quietly undervalued, careful, methodical analysts who preferred getting the details right over getting the credit, the way I once had been myself. My first senior hire, a woman named Sabrina who had spent 6 years at a much larger firm feeling exactly the way I once had, invisible despite doing most of the actual work that kept her division's accounts functioning, told me during her interview that she'd heard about my firm specifically because a hospital administrator she knew had mentioned, almost in passing, that Baptiste Health Strategy was the only consulting practice she'd worked with in a decade that had never once overpromised and underdelivered. I hired Sabrina on the spot, essentially, and she has since become one of the most important people in my company, running 2 of our largest engagements with exactly the kind of patient thoroughness I built the entire firm around. Julian and I talked, more than once during those growing years, about the strange, circuitous path that had led from a 6 a.m. termination email to a firm carrying my own name, employing people I genuinely respected, serving clients who trusted us specifically because we had never once tried to be something we weren't. He told me, one evening a couple of years into the Cresthaven engagement, sitting on our back porch after the kids, we'd had our first daughter by then, were finally asleep, that he thought the version of me building Baptiste Health Strategy seemed, in some hard-to-articulate way, more entirely herself than the version of me who had once worked so hard to succeed within someone else's institution. I think he was right about that, though it took me longer than it probably should have to fully believe it myself. Renata Okonkwo and I still speak regularly, not just about the Cresthaven engagement itself, which continues to run smoothly under a structure I'm genuinely proud of, but as something closer to real professional friends, the kind of relationship built slowly, over years, through consistent honesty rather than any single dramatic gesture. She told me once, over lunch a couple of years into our renewed engagement, that she had never doubted, even during the worst years under Priya's leadership, that reaching back out to me directly was the right instinct, because she remembered, clearly, exactly what kind of person had once told her an uncomfortable truth rather than simply reframing it. I think often about that morning after my wedding, sitting on the edge of a hotel bathtub in a robe with an embroidered bee, reading a termination email that had clearly been composed before 6 a.m. by someone who wanted to inflict maximum quiet damage with minimum confrontation. I think about how easy it would have been, in that moment, to simply accept the narrative Diane offered me, that this was a restructuring, that it wasn't personal, that these things simply happen in corporate life. I think about how much longer it might have taken me to understand what had actually happened if I hadn't insisted, years earlier, on a single protective clause in a contract I never imagined would matter this much. I think, too, about the version of myself who sat in that windowless conference room years before any of this happened, telling Renata Okonkwo an uncomfortable truth instead of the polished reframe Diane had once instructed me to give instead. I didn't know, in that moment, that honesty would eventually become the thing that saved my entire career, twice over, first by rebuilding a relationship everyone else had already written off, and years later by giving a client enough reason to trust me again after everything that had happened in between. I've come to believe, watching my own daughter grow older now, old enough to ask occasional questions about what I actually do for work, that the version of success worth modeling for her isn't the version built on being the loudest person in the room or the fastest to close a deal. It's the quieter, harder version, built on actually doing the work well enough and honestly enough that it protects you even when you can't yet see exactly how. Here's what I want you to take from this, if you take anything at all. When people push you out of something you built carefully and honestly, the instinct to simply walk away and rebuild somewhere entirely new is often the right one. And I want to be clear that rebuilding, for its own sake, mattered far more to my life over those 4 years than any eventual reckoning ever did. But sometimes the careful, unglamorous work you do out of simple professional caution, the fine print nobody else bothers to read closely, ends up protecting you in ways you couldn't have predicted at the time. You don't have to go looking for that kind of leverage. You just have to keep doing honest work, carefully, on your own terms, and trust that the people who actually valued that honesty will remember it, even years later, even after everything has changed. That's my story. If someone has ever taken something you built and handed it to someone else without a second thought, I hope you find your own version of quiet, careful rebuilding on your own terms at your own pace. And if this reminded you that the fine print you insist on, even when nobody else thinks it matters, is sometimes the thing that ends up protecting you most, I hope you keep reading it closely. Thank you for listening.